Courtney, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for coming tonight to hear my talk, which is about the Wheaton architecture of the architect Edward Dart. So let me, you see the picture on the first slide here. This is the St. Matthew United Church of Christ on the south side of Wheaton. Probably a lot of you know this building, I'm going to guess. Do I see a lot of nodding? Before we get started, I'll do my cursory slide that I did last time as well. Who I am, I've lived in Wheaton since 1975. I grew up on the south side of town, close to many houses designed by Edward Dart. I went to Whittier, Edison, and Wheaton Central, and then afterward I went to Knox College, Northwestern University, and the University of Chicago. So I write for the Chicago Tribune. I've done that for the last 26 years. I often cover Wheaton, but I also write about homes as well. I write a real estate column. I write news obituaries as well. And I love architecture, and I took a great interest in the homes around the Chicago Golf Club near where I grew up starting in 1994. So I currently live in a house designed by Jarvis Hunt, but it wasn't until much later that I understood who Edward Dart was and his significance. So I'm appreciative of the fact that Wheaton has had numerous prominent architects who've designed structures in Wheaton. We're going to spend tonight talking about Edward Dart, who he was, and why he was important to Wheaton. So Edward Dart was born in 1922, died in 1975. He was a very prominent mid-century modern architect. Here in Wheaton alone, he designed close to 20 houses and buildings. He designed another 4, at least, in the areas around Glen Ellyn. He designed a church in West Chicago, and then he designed the St. Procopius Abbey down in Lisle, next to Benedictine University. He did his work here during a very short period of time. It was about a 5-year time frame that he designed all the homes in Wheaton. His work was distinctive. I think as I go through some of the slides, and some of you who may live in Dart homes, who are familiar with them will know, when you see one, oftentimes you know it. He wasn't really a national architect. He almost exclusively worked in Chicago, the Chicago area. Not entirely, but pretty closely. He's easily the most prominent mid-century modern architect to ever produce a substantial body of work here in Wheaton. Other prominent mid-century modern architects had much more influential and more of a national reach were some gentlemen by the names of Ralph Rapson and Paul Schweiker. They also designed homes here in Wheaton we can talk about, but Dart is really the combination of being the best known in the Chicago area and the most prolific as well. Later in his career, he got bigger, so to speak, and so he designed some fairly meaningful structures outside of Wheaton, several buildings at Northwestern University on their campus in Evanston, and he actually designed Water Tower Place on North Michigan Avenue downtown. So how many works did he design? There's actually not even remotely close to a perfect list of the number of works he designed. His sister has said, she said that he was not good at keeping records or even keeping his drawings at all. So that makes it difficult. So in the lone biography about Dart that has been written, his sister said that he altogether worked on about 200 projects, over 100 of which were completed. Didn't sound like any kind of project list survived. Her own book doesn't list all of his projects, including all of the ones in Wheaton, and these are ones that are known. So, but even if her over 100 number is right, that means the work in Wheaton, Glen Ellyn, West Chicago, and Lisle, that's 1/5 to 1/4 of everything that he did. So it's meaningful. So I gave my last talk on May 2nd about Jarvis Hunt. Some of you may have attended this. Very, very different kind of architect, and it may be hard to imagine that there's actually a tie between the two. Jarvis Hunt was very classical. He worked from the 1890s until the 1920s. The other one was dyed-in-the-wool modernist who worked from the 1950s until the 1970s. But there are actually several similarities. So first off, I'm going to show you, does anyone recognize this subdivision here at all? This is the Fairways subdivision just south of Roosevelt, so the southwest corner of Roosevelt and Naperville roads. So right up there at the top in the upper right-hand corner, that's the PNC Bank. And then over here, this is the area east of Whittier School. So Fairway was the first portion of the old Green Valley Country Club to be subdivided. It was cut up in 1946. But in 1922, well before the Depression, well before World War II, a previous owner of Green Valley named Richard Prendergast, he actually proposed subdividing 16 of those acres for 36 home sites. And the architect he was going to use was a gentleman by the name of Andrew Rabori. These homes would have backed up to Roosevelt and Naperville roads. And who was Andrew Rabori? He was Jarvis Hunt's office partner from 1914 until 1918. Now, this plan never happened. The homes in the area that I'm showing you here weren't built until the 1940s and 50s. But it is interesting that you had this plan from Jarvis Hunt's partner. And Prendergast talked a good game. I love this Chicago Tribune article from 1922. It says here, owns a country club and never swats the pill, which is another way of saying never hits the golf club. And I love this. I love the subhead here, hand me a Northwestern timetable, Watson. So you see a picture of Prendergast there. He had some ties to Robert R. McCormick, the colonel from the McCantini, but that's really a discussion for another lecture. But that same area wound up becoming home to 6 Edward Dart designed homes. So today I think of the Fairways subdivision really as ground zero for Dart designed homes. You have at least 6 homes in that area were designed by Dart, and if you broaden the area a bit, it's like 10 or 12 that were designed by Edward Dart. So then the second tie between Edward Dart and Jarvis Hunt is the Great Lakes Naval Base. So one of Jarvis Hunt's highest profile commissions was the Great Lakes Naval Base up on Lake Michigan and north of Lake Bluff in the North Chicago area. Late in his career, well, he was part of a firm that he joined up with in the 1960s. Edward Dart actually designed some buildings at Great Lakes circa 1971. So let's go back to the beginning. So before I talk about Edward Dart's upbringing, though, let's take a look at the magnitude of what he did in Wheaton, and then we'll talk a little bit about his design aesthetic. Then we'll get through his early years, and we'll actually go to some of the specific homes. So again, he designed at least 17 single-family houses in the Wheaton area between 1953 and 1958. He designed the St. Matthew United Church of Christ. He designed another church out in West Chicago, just south of Roosevelt Road. He designed the shelter at Northside Park, the warming shelter. Do most of you know that building? So, and if you think about it, it very much looks like a Dart structure. Then he designed numerous homes in unincorporated areas south of Glen Ellyn, down in Glen Ellyn Woods. Then one of his most iconic and best regarded designs is the St. Procopius Abbey in Lisle. That's not that far southeast of Wheaton. Design-wise, you'd call his work squarely mid-century modern. So he studied at the Yale School of Architecture under some modernists, including Paul Schweiker, who we talked about, Richard Neutra, and several others. Somewhat surprisingly, though, little has been written about exactly why Dart embraced modernism. So some of it was the time he was coming up. He was getting educated right after World War II. And undoubtedly, these instructors, who were modernists themselves, had some influence. The best summation of his philosophy came from his own sister, who in this biography, she talked about, quote, the things we cared so passionately about, the clean design, the simplicity, and the freedom of the new way of life. I mean, that just screams like a repudiation of classical architecture, lots of adornments, columns, Roman, Georgian features. He also had always cited the varied architecture of New Orleans, which is where he was raised, as having an influence on his work as well. So now let's go to New Orleans. That was where Edward Dart came from. It's sort of unlikely that he came to Wheaton, actually, or came to the Chicago area at all. He was born in New Orleans. You see, his name was Edouard Dupaquier Dart. People called him Ned as a child, although as a grown-up, he wanted to be known as Ed. He's the fourth of 5 children. He was born in his parents' home, and he later described his own house as building, not architecture, is what he called it. So this is, there's a baby picture here, a toddler picture. That's him in front. You see him there. He's the smallest one. This is why his youngest sibling hasn't been born yet. And then in 1934, he and his brother came to Chicago, and they visited the Century of Progress. For those wondering, he would have been about 12 at the time. Now, during those years of school, in high school and junior high, nobody would accuse him of being a genius or a hard worker. He was anything but. And years later, his sister said it was stunning that he ended up having so much success relative even to his own siblings because he didn't display much in the way of hard work, innovation, or genius when he was younger. So in his second year at his private school, he was expelled for saying something unforgivable about one of the teachers at the school. I've read that it was about his golf game, of all things. So I don't know how unforgivable that could be, but he was allowed to return. And his father was this perpetual optimist who kept thinking, hey, if we just do this, our son will flourish and thrive. But you see here in 1940, when he was 18, there was a letter that came from the headmaster that said, Ned has failed to pass English, and it is unlikely he will graduate. Everything depends on his passing a re-exam. He actually did pass, he did graduate, and he got into the University of Virginia, where in his only year there, he got 4 Fs and a D in his final exam. So this is Edward Dart. He's a very dashing-looking fellow there, if you take a look at him. So I said it was his only year there. That wasn't exactly right. He did go back to Virginia for a second freshman year, and that was after a summer job working on a surveying team. I should say, though, he also joined an exclusive drinking club when he was on campus at UVA. But what really did it for him was ROTC. He got involved in ROTC, and that gave him a sense of purpose. He joined the Navy and served during World War II. Came back to Illinois in October of 1944. You all remember the old Glenview Naval Air Station that isn't there anymore. But during the war, he took a real interest in commercial art and architecture. He had a sketch pad. He started drawing, took a real keen interest in this. Came back to the U.S. in 1945 and left active duty in January of 1946. A lot of men did this at that time. Married his future wife, Wilma, and then he enrolled in the Yale School of Architecture. Graduated in 1949. While he was in school, he embarked on his first design, which was a house for his parents in Vermont. So if you take a look at this design there on the left, a lot of use of wood and stone. There's a photograph of it on the right. This is what it ended up being. I think this is really interesting. This is the first known design by Edward Dart. And so I love looking at this. I think it's really, to me, it's fascinating and striking. So after he got out of Yale, he got 2 job offers. One was with Edward Durrell Stone, who taught him. The other one is from Paul Schweiker. Schweiker actually was working in Roselle at the time. So he took a job with Schweiker and with Schweiker's partner, and he moved to Illinois, found a home in Itasca. So along with the late TV weatherman Harry Volkman, he became one of the most famous residents that I know of Itasca. But soon afterward, he was interested in heading more northwest. He went out first to Palatine and then all the way up to the Barrington area, where he lived for the rest of his life. Early in his career, you'll see here, he actually met Frank Lloyd Wright, who was well into his 80s. They went up to Taliesin, up at Spring Green, and Wright had invited many area architects to Taliesin in connection with the architects' convention that was going on in Chicago. And I absolutely love this. Dart disappeared from his family for some time. He returned and he told his family members, "The master spoke to me." He did, his family members said. "What did he say to you?" He said, "Put out that cigarette. We neither smoke nor wear hats in the buildings." Then Wright turned around and walked away with his hat squarely on his head. So then he worked with Schweiker, but only for about a year or so. He really chafed at working under Schweiker. He wanted to do more, and he wanted more autonomy. But they were friendly, but it was a very friendly parting. So he then ended up trying to strike off on his own, wasn't very successful, so he took a job at Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. He was there for a bit and then quit there, didn't like doing that, really didn't like working for someone else, ended up going back to working for himself. He opened up offices. Strangely, he did a lot of work on the North Shore. So strangely, he lived in Barrington, but he opened up an office in Highland Park. I think he saw some moneyed clients that he thought he could get in good with, started designing some homes on the North Shore, but then did a lot of work out in Barrington as well, had an office in Barrington for a time as well. And then he designed his own home, actually up in Barrington in the 1950 and 1951. And then work started picking up, and in 1952, got his first commission to design a church in Barrington. What really brought him to Wheaton was a partner. It was through Paul Schweiker. So what happened was, remember that plat map I showed you of the Fairways subdivision? So his first work in Wheaton was for the home builder Graham Stewart, who built many of the homes in the Fairways subdivision. So why did Dart connect with him? It was because Dart's old boss, Paul Schweiker, designed a house on East Park Avenue, very close to Naperville Road. You all drive by there a lot. And the Fairways subdivision. He designed it for Stewart as for his own personal home. His wife, Ruth Cook Stewart, had seen Schweiker's designs and liked what he was doing. So Stewart started working with Dart, and the philosophy was they wanted to put together quality, affordable, post-war houses that did not look like typical cookie-cutter homes. These would be small and modest, but affordable and interesting too. And so the partnership continued. The first house that Dart designed in Wheaton was on Naperville Road. You wouldn't know it today because it's been redone, but it was the first Wheaton appearance of the celebrated North Gate home design, which I'm going to talk about. You see this drawing here of the North Gate. So if you go here, it was also known as the North Gate 21. So Dart and Stewart collaborated on this North Gate 21. That's the type of Dart home you see most around Wheaton. Are a lot of you familiar with that design? Probably a lot of you are. So 21 stood for the 21st century. They were all oriented east-west, so you really got a lot of that southern exposure. It really championed this idea of passive solar heating. So almost all of the designs you see in Wheaton are North Gates, and some were built in other suburbs as well, including in Barrington and all the way up in Highland Park. And the design evolved over time, not Northgates don't all look alike. There are tremendous similarities, but there are also subtle but important differences as time went on. So this is the first one. Some of you probably know this structure. It's a dentist's office on Naperville Road. I don't know if I see some nods there. It was actually designed for a guy named Kenneth Ladwig, who unfortunately died very young, but it was a combination dentist's office / home. It doesn't really look like a Northgate, I know, but that's because it's been modified since it was originally constructed. That's not uncommon. You've seen a number of Dart homes modified. This is the only known Dart house in Wheaton that's been demolished. Some of you might remember this. This one's on 116 East Elm Street. I took this picture right before it was torn down in 2013. Building permit was taken out in 1953, and there's an indoor pool that was put on later. That is an indoor pool room was not designed by Dart. But the idea is this looks a lot different from the Northgates. I mean, it is not as the carbon copy of the Northgates that you'll see, but it was also his earliest design, and he was still refining his design aesthetic. So I'll show you, this is the indoor pool from the back, again, that was added on in 1958. I took this as well right before it came down. You know, we don't have a lot of indoor pools in Wheaton, as you all know. This is pretty unusual. And then here's actually a picture of the indoor pool itself. So this is right before it came down. And so then, if you go to, this is 109 East Park Avenue. This is one of the earliest Northgate designs as well. If you see it here, and then moving right along, this is 1025 Gammon Road, also in that Fairway subdivision. And if you look the way it's built into the hill, you see the hill in front of it. It's really quite pleasing to the eye, I think. This is 421 Pershing Avenue. This is a smaller Northgate, it's a Northgate variation is what you'd call it, but it's just east of Naperville Road on Pershing. And then this one is 911 East Willow Avenue. This is directly north of Lowell School, if you know where that is. Continuing on, this is 1320 Nelson Circle. I have to say thanks to Roberta Stewart for providing me with these early photographs. So I'm going to show you what it looked like in the 1970s. This is in Northgate. I don't know if you know where Nelson Circle is. It's over by Lincoln School. This backs up to the Bethel Presbyterian Church. What's interesting is how modified this house ended up being later on. So these are a couple of early photos of what it looked like in the 1970s. I'll show you it. There are some interiors here as well that you might be interested in seeing. And take a look here at the fireplace. And I fear I skipped over one, and forgive me if I did. Yeah, I did. This is the back. I'm sorry. So this is the front, and this is the back. All right, still learning how to use this. And then here's some interiors as well of the home. And again, mid-1970s. And then here's what it looks like today. You would be forgiven for not even thinking this was an Edward Dart designed home at all, actually. So it was pretty significantly renovated. And that's happened with some other Dart homes as well. People have come along and taken them and modernized them. Another home here, some people in the front row are probably going to recognize this house here as well. This is at 111 East Elm Street. This is right across the street from the one I showed you earlier with the indoor pool. So now we're going to hop away from the Fairway neighborhood. This is over, some of you may know, over near Lorraine Road, north of Hill Avenue. There's an area of Wheaton that has Glen Ellyn mailing. Some of you may know where that area is. This is 580 Wilshire Avenue. This was built in 1954, and this is an Edward Dart design as well. It's got a different look to it as well, but I'd highly recommend going over and taking a look at it. It's very interesting in terms of the carport that you see. And then this is 328 West Elm Street. This was owned by the same family from 1985 until 2007, and during that time they put a second level on it. So it was originally built as the one-story Northgate, but it had a second floor put on it. Sometime in the, I think, 1980s or 1990s that was done. This is 123 West Elm Street. This was also expanded as well. Any of you who know Whittier School, you'll remember that the attendant secretary, Mrs. Jones, lived here back in the 1970s. Subsequent to her ownership, though, it was added on to. And then this is 211 East Park Avenue. We're also, again, in the Fairway subdivision as well. Are you seeing a lot of similarities, particularly with the windows? You all are probably seeing. The beams are very similar as well. They were designed that way. And this one is right across the street from Whittier School. This is from the 1955 Chicago Tribune. This is a drawing, or actually I think it was probably a photograph that I grabbed. But here, this shows you here what it says here. Modern home on a sloping lot, has both stories at ground level, top at left and lower at right end. So, and it was furnished by the Vignola Furniture Company. I don't know if any of you have heard of that or not. I had not. This is what it looks like today. So you see, it is little changed over a 64-year time frame. This is 1103 East Willow Avenue. This is over east of President Street. I want to make sure I'm doing this in the right order. Yeah, this is, but again, it's a north gate as well. Again, you see a large number of these were built. Everything I've shown you was built between 1953 and 1955. So there is a lot of post-war demand for this in Wheaton. And these were, again, very affordable homes. This is 266 East Park Avenue. So this is right at the corner of Park Avenue and Naperville Road. And so you can see the back of this. If you're heading north on Naperville Road, just north of Elm Street, you can actually see there's a full set of windows that face south on the back of it that are on the lower level as well. So then this is 816 West Elm Street here. This got a tremendous amount of publicity when it was built in the mid-1950s here, you see. But there's a lot of marketing collateral here. It's hard for me to read it all, but you can get some idea from looking at it for the buyer who can afford it. Near perfection here, you see. Dart is actually identified as the architect. You've got who the builder associates are. You see the builder here as well. But the idea behind this as well was, I think, to try to convey a couple of things. That if you look in the upper right-hand corner, it's the house that's years ahead of its time as well. And so the idea behind it, if you look here, it's hard to read that type, and it's actually hard for me to read it too, but if you say there are a few incurable romantics in the architectural world who believe that the only dwelling extant today worthy of all its fantastic cost is that pile of grandeur called Versailles in Paris. This may be, but the old palace never seemed quite our idea of a comfortable haven. And this house, for all its claims of extravagance, it's large indeed, 3,600 square feet. It's built on 3 levels with a long, low, very simple facade. There, the simplicity stops. The rear elevation is a different matter. Here, the house puts its best foot forward, and a stately, impressive foot it is. And that's actually true. What you're looking at here is the rear of the house here. So that's the front of the house is what you see here, and that's the rear. We'll move forward to the present day. This is an evening shot of the home here from the front, and this is the back of the house as well. Pretty striking, isn't it? So there are some interior photos of it as well. See, what you see with Dart, you see a lot of uses of wood, obviously, a lot of brick, in some cases, you have a soaring ceiling here as well. And then don't be confused by the addresses. These are one block apart. You have 816, and then you have 916 West Elm Street. He designed that as well. So here's a shot of 916 just from the east. And then this here, again, is the front shot. It's probably not my best photographic work, but it should give you some idea. Again, these were all built right about the exact same time. So the one thing that I would love to know more about is how he got the commission for the Northside Park warming shelter. But if you see here, you all notice right there on the water, there's a small dock of some kind right in front of it. It has restrooms in it, but it's also a warming shelter. And again, it was built in late 1956 and early 1957. We're nearing the end of his work in Wheaton here. This is 925 Arbor Court. Arbor Court is a small street that extends west from, I want to say, Aurora Way, I think, just south of Roosevelt Road. There are a number of homes that Stewart built on that street, but this is the only obvious Dart design in that. And then with that, Edward Dart's Wheaton house work just stopped. He was 35 years old, and he stopped designing houses in Wheaton. I think what happened was he saw his career was growing bigger. He started taking on jobs all over the Chicago area, including a large number of church designs. He did continue to design houses, but not in Wheaton. So the record shows he designed homes in Highland Park, Barrington, Glencoe, Barrington, Highland Park, Glenview. There was one in his native Louisiana, Lake Forest, Glencoe, and Barrington, but nothing more in Wheaton, at least of a residential nature. However, he did later design one church in Wheaton, which I showed you the picture earlier, St. Matthew United Church of Christ, over there on Gables Boulevard. If you look here, here's a shot of it from another angle as well. So it's a gorgeous, have a number of you been inside the building? It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous structure. It's really, but that wasn't the only church he designed in the area. So some of you may or may not remember the Episcopal Church of the Resurrection. That's on Route 59, just south of Roosevelt Road in West Chicago. So this was an Episcopal church. It was built in 1963. What happened was sort of interesting, was that in 2007, this church underwent a divorce from the Episcopal Diocese of Chicago. And so somewhat strikingly, the members and the leaders of the congregation, they stormed out in a very dramatic ceremony of the church, and they both figuratively, but also in actuality, handed over the keys of the building. They were at odds with a church policy, set about to find a new location in West Chicago, which they did. And with that, the Episcopal Church was left with an empty building. And unfortunately, you can probably guess what happened next. It was torn down. A lot of people don't know this. I didn't know this before I started working on this talk. It was torn down in 2016. What happened was it was placed on the endangered structures list by Landmarks Illinois in 2009. I don't know why no one bought it, but the Forest Preserve District was very interested in it. The property borders a river, and the Forest Preserve District paid $420,000 for it. In their assessment of it, the Forest Preserve District said the buildings were in fair to poor condition, which is always what a landowner says when they would like to tear a building down. Always. The demolition received no media coverage of any kind. This is probably a statement on the diminution of local media coverage. I think 10 or 20 years ago, this would have gotten more coverage. Unfortunately, it didn't. It was quietly demolished in 2016. If you drive by it today, as I did over the weekend, you would have absolutely no idea it was ever there. There are no markings. There's no driveway approach. There's nothing. It's as if it never existed. It's very, very sad. Because again, if you look at it, it was quite a striking structure, you see. It's hard to believe that a building that was less than 60 years old, a church building, a use couldn't be found for it. So I talked about Glen Ellyn. Dart also designed at least 4 houses north and south of Glen Ellyn. These were all Northgate designs. One is north of Glen Ellyn. This is the one I'm showing you here. Door on the patio has the same pattern as some screen doors on other Dart homes. This is very close to Glendale Heights. It's an unincorporated area north of Glen Ellyn. 3 others are down in the Glen Ellyn Woods Valley View area. One of these actually backs up to Wheaton city limits, interestingly enough. So these 3 were built between 1955 and 1960. And then there's this mystery here on Aurora Way, which I'm absolutely fascinated by. So there's a Northgate design on Aurora Way, just north of Roosevelt Road. You drive by it and you swear it's a Dart house, but it's actually oriented north-south, not east-west, like every other Northgate is east-west. This one is north-south. I pulled the City of Wheaton building permit because that's the kind of thing I like to do. And you'll see here, if you look closely, it says who the architectural firm is, registered architect Frazier Raftery. It's a very well-known architectural firm in the Chicago area during that era. So it's not obvious to me why Frazier Raftery designed something that was looks to me so much to be an Edward Dart design. So then I wanted to talk about Bethel Presbyterian Church. Do you all know that on Naperville Road? So just to be clear, Edward Dart did not design this. It was built in 1968 and 1969. However, I consider it to be part of his legacy. The architect of record, as you'll see here over on the right-hand side, is a gentleman by the name of Edward Straka. He worked for Dart from 1956 until 1965. After that, he ran his own firm. We're going to talk more about what Dart did after 1965 in a moment. But Edward, he was the longest-serving associate with Edward Dart. So he knew Dart better than anyone professionally, I would submit. And he later described Dart as being one of the few who could understand Mies van der Rohe and the international school without, quote, simply turning out sterile boxes, as most of the others at that time did. So when I looked at this building, I've driven by it many times, you all have too, to me, I wondered, it was a combination of things. The design looked modern. The brick made me wonder if Dart had designed it. So once again, I pulled the building permit, because that's the kind of thing I do. And you'll see Edward Straka there is credited as the architect. He designed this just 3 years after he and Dart parted ways. So I consider this broadly some of Edward Dart's legacy. It's hard not to think that he learned a lot of what he learned from his former colleague and boss, Edward Dart. This is a picture of it. There are obviously some notable differences between it and the St. Matthew's Church building. For one, you see this is more square and boxy. Some might even say there are some brutalist features to this. That might be too harsh. I don't know. I don't want to offend any parishioners of Bethel Presbyterian Church. It's certainly, to me, seems to me to be a very well kept up building. But again, it doesn't have some of the angular work that you see in St. Matthew United Church of Christ. But I did want to take a moment to discuss it, because I think it's fair to say Edward Straka is completely unknown. I don't know if any of you in this room have ever heard of him. Is there one here? I hadn't either. So, but I think he deserves some acclaim for having worked for Dart as long as he had, for going out on his own. He had a brother, Paul, who also designed a large number of churches. So some later years, let's talk about Edward Dart, and then we'll wrap up. In his later years, he designed a ton of churches. He designed more than 25 churches in all. His final church, he actually won an award for. That was one in Western Springs. It was actually completed after he died in 1977. A lot of you probably know the Indian Lakes Resort up in Bloomingdale. He designed that. He designed things at a sports center at Lake Forest College. He designed a public parking deck in Evanston. His churches were all over the place. He did a lot down in the south suburbs. He even went outside of the Chicago area, Indianapolis, you see there, Benton Harbor, Michigan, but in a wide variety of suburbs. Almost all of these church buildings still stand. I think there's one that was demolished. I want to say it was in Gary, Indiana. But by the mid-1960s, his colleagues, and by colleagues I refer to this guy Straka, who worked for him, he said Dart was impatient. He was tired of doing houses. He said this, and he wanted to do bigger buildings. So what happened was, in 1965, a large Chicago firm, Lobel, Schlossman, and Bennett, offered Dart a partnership. Bennett had been the dean of the Yale School of Architecture, while Dart had been a student there, so they knew each other that way. So what happened was, Edward Dart then joined this large firm, started working downtown on Wacker Drive. We're going to talk about his work there in a moment. This was part of that, but one of his most prominent designs is St. Procopius Abbey. You all probably know that, down on College Road, which is the extension of Yackley Road down in Lisle. He designed that from 1966 until 1967. Construction work started in 1968, and the monks moved in June of 1970. Dart's sister described it as, quote, clean and unadorned, with its angular shape silhouetted against the sky. She noted that it has both a purity of design and yet a feeling of warmth and humanness at every turn. Well, let's see about that, shall we? So this is a drawing of it when it was underway. And then this is an interior shot of it here. What do you think? Do you see warmth and humanness at every turn? Do you see a purity of design? I do. And then here are some photos of it that I took. And I will tell you, I find it a very difficult building to photograph. I'm not a professional photographer, but it is really hard to get up close to it and get a shot that isn't blocked by foliage or trees in one direction or another. So I tried to take a few different ones. Feel free to laugh at my photographic skills, but what I'm struck by is you really do see that angular shape silhouetted against the sky. You can, and then this is an older shot of it as well. So I wanted you all to take a look at it. I know it's not Wheaton, so I'm cheating a bit. I'm going a little bit outside of Wheaton, but it is a prominent structure of his, and really it is, I think his own family viewed this as one of the works that they were proudest of that he did. So let me talk about his final years here. This one I'm actually really proud of. So as a Northwestern University alum, his biggest designs were yet to come. He did 2 works up on the campus of Northwestern. He did the Pick Stager Concert Hall, and he did the Norris University Student Center up at Northwestern. If you look up there, again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because this is a talk about Wheaton architecture, but what you see here is with Pick Stager, you see how much wood he uses within the interior. It is an incredibly well-regarded theater when it comes to the acoustics of it by people who work in the business, the music faculty at Northwestern, and as well as those who've performed there. If you look there on the right, that is an image of the exterior of Picksteger right after it opened. It opened just a couple of months after Dart passed away. Now we're going to move toward an area where Dart took on a ton of criticism. So his final, or maybe not his final work, but probably the final work he worked on when he was alive was Water Tower Place on North Michigan Avenue. It is easily his most controversial design. He was hired in 1970, and in 1971 he told the Chicago Tribune, "This is the greatest, most exciting project I've been privileged to do." This is what Dart was looking for. He was looking for a big building. He was looking for a signature project. Unfortunately, few critics actually liked Water Tower Place. So Paul Gapp, the late Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic of the Tribune, he called it one of Chicago's most prominent architectural failures of the late 20th century. And he said it's a building that says nothing about itself, but manages to present embarrassingly ugly facades at the same time. He also called it a dowdy young millionairess with warts on her nose. The Tribune's own editorial page, though, begged to differ. And in 1975, the editorial page called it, quote, one of Chicago's most glamorous new landmarks. And they said it's a, quote, fitting addition that makes the Magnificent Mile even more magnificent. So it's fair to say that you get differing views on modern architecture. But in his final days, actually, Dart himself was very angry about how Water Tower Place came together. He was frustrated with his own partner, Jerry Lobel. He didn't like what was being used. You know, there's marble on the exterior of Water Tower Place. He was very frustrated at that. That was what the client wanted. We can talk about who the client was, but he found it to be too inhuman of a building material for the exterior. Interestingly enough, I think he wanted granite, which I don't think of as being that warmer. I think that is fairly inhuman as well. But the fact is, he was pretty frustrated about it, and Gapp has written about that as well. Now, here's a lovely photograph of Water Tower Place at night. We would all agree, going down North Michigan Avenue, particularly around the holidays, that's a really pleasant and festive thing. The idea behind Water Tower Place was obviously it's supposed to be a city within a building. You all know this if you've gone shopping there. It doesn't have a lot of windows, as you know, when you think of it from the criticism that you read, it does stand out like a sore thumb on North Michigan Avenue. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So let's move forward and talk a little bit about his death and his legacy. So he died at only age 53. He had a stroke. He never regained consciousness. It was described as an embolism. I didn't put it in my slides, but he was a smoker and a drinker. His family and friends dismissed that had anything to do with why he had the stroke and the embolism. Who can say? But there was a lot of chatter that he was under a lot of stress as well about Water Tower Place. There's no question, though, that he was appreciated in his own time and that his legacy was secure from the get-go. I don't think every architect can say that. The Tribune's Paul Gapp, again, who I had the pleasure of meeting when I was a child with my father, he said about Dart in 1975, quote, he left a legacy of many excellent churches, residences, and other buildings which brought him awards. For those, he will be remembered. Here's a photograph of Dart late in life, smoking a pipe, you'll see here. I think this was taken overseas. He was traveling at the time. But let's take this back to Wheaton, okay? There hasn't been much scholarly work written about Edward Dart. Architectural historians have started making sense of his work. He's very popular among the mid-century modern enthusiast crowd, for sure. And he spent a lot of time here in the early part of his career doing smaller jobs. It's clear that he's the most prominent and most prolific mid-century modern architect who operated in Wheaton. And what's really, I think, a credit to the owners of his structures here in Wheaton is that very little of his area work has been torn down. In this era, we live in a tear-down era. You see the signs in front of old houses all the time around Wheaton. That's a real testament, I think, to the durability and uniqueness of what he produced. So I feel like we should all be proud of our association with Edward Dart and the fact that owners have loved his work and have hung on to it, have invested in it, have worked to try to keep it relevant. More than 6 decades later, these buildings remain relevant, and most of all, they remain appreciated by their owners. Thank you all very much. And here's another photograph of Edward Dart, a little bit earlier in his career.